Welcome. I'm Ryan, and today we will be discussing the importance of gender roles in the novel, The Turner House. In particular, we will be analyzing how toxic masculinity and female helplessness to the creation of a hostile environment for the Turner family. In terms of this particular analysis, though, the term environment will refer to social environments. And now you may be thinking, whoa, Ryan, what even is a social environment? From what I know, the environment around me consists of walls, trees, bushes outside. Well, that's what I thought too. But no worries, me and the handy-dandy-dictionary.com have got you covered. So, according to this wonderful website, a social environment is the environment developed by humans as contrasted with the natural environment, society as a whole, especially in its relation to the individual. Though we cannot see a social environment, we can recognize how our interactions with others create a certain atmosphere in a particular setting. For example, this English course, English 151 with Professor Kennedy, has a motivational, positive, discussion-based, friendly atmosphere. Such feelings in this environment are created via the interactions between us students and our professor. We laugh, we share personal joys, and we work hard. So, now that we understand that social environments are a type of environment, let's look at how Cha-Cha and Leela enact gender stereotypes, which in turn create a tense social environment for the Turner family members. Toxic masculinity, a defining feature of male stereotypes, plays a huge role in the Turner house, and in particular, the idea of suppressing emotion has a significant contribution to the disconnect between the Turner men and women. For those unfamiliar with the phrase toxic masculinity, it refers to activities or societal norms that males participate in or attempt to live up to, which enforce ideas of aggressiveness, domination, and lack of emotional vulnerability. Now let's start with Cha-Cha. As the eldest Turner child, Cha-Cha is pressured to live up to his father's expectations. These expectations in particular embodied strength and masculinity, resulting in Cha-Cha's inability to express emotion. This inability to effectively communicate how he was feeling ultimately leads to a disruption in his and Tina's relationship. One of our first encounters of Cha-Cha's suppression of feelings occurs in 1967 on page 95, where Francis urinates on his son's forehead. Flournoy writes, "His father had pissed on his forehead when he should have been at home protecting his family, if this seemed a special, premeditated disrespect. Rather than jumping out from underneath the porch, demanding to be recognized by his father, Cha-Cha remained silent and still, waiting until after his father leaves before crawling out from beneath the house. It is critical to recognize here that Cha-Cha's choice to remain silent derives from a certain power dynamic between Francis and Cha-Cha. It is clear that Cha-Cha fears his father in his choice to remain silent, and in doing so, he suppresses how he feels." Going further, while visiting Francis's gravesite on page 195, it is expressed that Cha-Cha experiences an urge to cry, but knew better and tamped it down. In particular, the phrase "knew better" signifies to readers that Cha-Cha had been taught that crying was unacceptable for Turner men. Perhaps that had been instilled upon him at a young age. As Cha-Cha is an adult in this visitation scene at his father's grave, we can recognize that this inability to express emotion has followed him throughout his life. As mentioned prior, a defining trait of toxic masculinity is the belief that men should suppress emotion, or in other terms, suck it up. I argue that Cha-Cha suppresses his emotion throughout his childhood in fear of being judged by his father for seeming weak. But what impact does this have on the Turner family's environment? Well, later in the novel, it is revealed that Cha-Cha has been having recurring encounters with the Haints in his bedroom. Tina, being a religious woman, attempts to understand Cha-Cha's troubles, but ultimately, her religious mindset steers her away from the possible realness of the Haint. Cha-Cha, being an ineffective communicator, further complicates Tina's understanding of what he is experiencing, ultimately choosing to continue seeing his therapist, Alice, with whom he is infatuated with. Ultimately, Cha-Cha reaches the point where his romantic desire towards Alice leads to an inability to have sex with Tina. On page 222, Cha-Cha reveals that, not long ago, sex had still been very much a part of his and Tina's life. But, after beginning to see Alice, because he was unable to express his traumatic experience with others, their sexual life comes to a dramatic halt. Though Tina attempts to console Cha-Cha, he remains distant and continues having romantic fantasies of Alice. During this time, his and Tina's relationship suffers so much that they rarely sleep in the same bed together. After Cha-Cha begins distancing himself from Tina, she becomes extremely skeptical of Cha-Cha and Alice's relationship, to the point where she is convinced that Cha-Cha is having an affair. He could have cheated on her hundreds, if not thousands of times. These assumptions made by Tina result in a massive argument where eventually Tina leaves the home and remains with their son Chucky for a few days. To summarize, I argue that Cha-Cha's inability to communicate his emotions with Tina, caused by encounters with Francis as a child, ultimately create a tense environment between himself and Tina, which leads to Tina's choice to leave their family home. In this analysis, I cannot help but ask, if Cha-Cha had learned how to combat the toxic masculinity ideal of not being able to express emotion, could the tense social environment between Tina and himself have been completely avoided? I know, that was a lot to handle, but I will again reiterate, the male gender stereotype, which embraces toxic masculinity, had full participation in creating a hostile environment between Cha-Cha and Tina. Now that we've analyzed how male stereotypes play into the creation of the Turner environment, let's take a look at how female stereotypes contribute as well. The typical female gender stereotype labels women as docile, submissive, and domesticated individuals who are in need of a male savior. Though there are multiple instances in this novel where we see the Turner female siblings as inferior to their male counterparts, I would like to bring attention to Leela's particular role in the novel. Though we do not see her as embodying the typical female stereotype due to her lack of connection with her daughter, absence of a husband, and not having a concrete living situation, I argue that her embodiment of other traits contributes to the dysfunctional Turner environment. Though we may not see Leela as domesticated, we do see her as a submissive, helpless individual who is temporarily saved from her gambling addiction by David. These particular traits contribute to her disconnect with Cha-Cha, and especially with her daughter, Brienne. When we are first introduced to Leela, we are made aware of her eviction and gambling addiction. In the scenes where Leela describes gambling, she says that the chips looked like candy, and the feel of them, the click and dry slide of them in her palm was gratifying. Such descriptive imagery gives a sense to readers that Leela's gambling makes her feel complete and alive. We are made aware of how serious her addiction is when she enters the vacant family house on Yarrow Street. Rather than asking a sibling for help out of fear of being judged, she chooses to continue gambling in hope of earning more money. Though we may look at this and think, I don't understand how this encaptures the female gender stereotype. We are made aware of how desperate and entrapped Leela is with her gambling. She is unable to save herself and is in need of someone else to save her. This aligns with the idea that women need saviors, and lo and behold, she becomes dependent on her siblings and David. Though Leela repeats time and time again that she don't need saving, her actions say otherwise when she sells particular Turner House items to the pawn shop. In selling her siblings' precious items, she is therefore using a part of her siblings to her own personal benefit. Therefore, she confirms the idea that women are dependent on others. We also see later in the novel that she borrows $900 from Marlene. Though we could shrug this off and say, well, they're family, that's what family is for. You help each other. We must remember the helpless light that only Leela is portrayed in, which is caused by her addiction to gambling. She is a slave to the chips, and someone viewed as strong would be able to combat such addiction and be able to financially support themselves. But when David enters the picture, we recognize the number of times we see Leela in the casino, and speaking of gambling, dramatically decreases. Though the itch to gamble may have still been present during the time of her relationship, her addiction seemed to be under control. It isn't until David breaks up with Leela that we see her re-enter the casino again. She arrives at 10 a.m. She didn't care if she made profit. She was gambling for time, for stillness. From this, we must ask, what changed during this time period that allowed Leela to get her addiction somewhat under control? The answer is in David. It was only with the male's help that her life could return to somewhat normal. She slept in a comfortable bed and ate nice meals with David. So, now that we see how she is in fact portrayed as a weak female who is dependent on others, let's take a look at how this plays a role in creating a tense environment for Leela with her other siblings. Leela's dependency on others ultimately leads to a disconnect among the Turner family members. Because she is ashamed of her current situation, she completely separates and removes herself from the family and resorts to Brienne. Brienne, at the sight of her mother approaching her apartment, felt an urge to pick up her baby and run into the bedroom like she did to avoid a Jehovah's Witness. In completely relying on Brienne, she pushes her daughter away, where eventually Brienne makes the decision to move to Chicago. In this, we recognize the implications of addiction in familial relationships. It is in Leela's inability to save herself, to which she drives away Brienne, resulting in a complete environmental disconnect in that aspect of the Turner family. Leela, though claiming not needing help, completely depends on others to save her, which plays into the female gender stereotype that women need saving. In approaching the text with a gender lens, we recognize how this particular stereotype plays into the toxic atmosphere between Brienne and her mother. You may be wondering why it was important to sit through all of this, but have no fear. I will explain in the next clip why examining this text through a gender lens is immensely fulfilling. Time has come to reflect on the role of gender stereotypes in your life. How do you see yourself participating in gender roles? And what impact does this have on your own environment? Do you feel suffocated or trapped, like you need saving? Or do you have trouble expressing emotion, kind of like Francis and Cha-Cha? In observing the impact that gender roles have on the Turner environment, we must also ask ourselves how our participation in such roles influences our own atmospheres. I attest that if we refuse gender stereotypes and reject pathways of least resistance in society, that we too can cultivate meaningful, positive environments that facilitate healthy growing and learning. Men can cry, and women are capable of saving themselves. Though the world is already changing, what role can you participate in to reject common stereotypes? Thank you all for watching, and until next time.